Let's get some more analysis now, and we can speak to John Gutierrez, who is assistant professor at John Jay College of the City University of New York. Thank you so much for speaking to us. How significant are these protests, in your opinion, and how significant of a threat do they pose to President Miguel Diaz-Canel?
Well, they're certainly the most significant protests that we've had in Cuba, arguably since the beginning of the revolution in 1959. They were spread out across the country. People took to the streets. The last time that we had anything resembling this was 1994, when there were protests in Havana, and that was really limited to the Cuban capital. In terms of its impact, that really remains to be seen. I think what's very clear from the scope of the protest yesterday and quite frankly, the episodes of violence, is that the Cuban government's absolute control over the Cuban street has fractured. And that may prompt a series of reactions from the Cuban government that we really haven't seen in decades.
Yeah, and we heard from the president yesterday talking about how the Cuban-American mafia is to blame for all of this. I mean, who is this mafia that he's talking about?
Well, in some ways, the Cuban-American mafia is one of the great boogeymen of the Cuban Revolution. There's no question that there are elements, and historically have been elements in the Cuban-American community in the United States who have worked diligently to try to overthrow the Cuban government. But what's also true is that there are hundreds of thousands of Cubans in the United States who regularly try to send remittances to their families in Cuba, travel to the island, are less interested in politics than they are in the well-being of their families. And those people, too, are expressing their solidarity with the protesters. Why? Because they see on a daily basis and hear from their families through WhatsApp and through other social media platforms that the economic and political situation on the island has grown worse in the last several years. And so from a rhetorical standpoint, Diaz-Canel mentioning the quote-unquote mafia in Miami is part and parcel of what the Cuban government has always done. In reality, it's a much more complicated relationship that exists between Cubans in the diaspora and the island.
Sure. And I mean, Washington's stance towards Havana is a little bit difficult to follow for the rest of the world, though. I mean, we had engagement from the Obama administration, sanctions imposed again by President Trump, and they haven't been lifted by President Joe Biden. And I wondered, if you think there's an opportunity here for Washington to perhaps think about re-engaging with Havana.
Well, I think those conversations have already begun at the highest levels of the Biden administration. I think people are understandably frustrated that the administration hasn't placed Cuba at the top of its foreign policy priority list. But the world is a very complicated place for the United States. There is Afghanistan, there is Haiti, and there is, quite frankly, the situation of the pandemic and the economy trying to recover after the pandemic, or at least as we begin to transition out of it. So I think he has a full plate. And while Cuba may very well be the single most important thing to Cubans, or U.S. policy to Cuba may be very important to Cubans, it isn't necessarily at the top of the list of things that the Biden administration is focusing on. That being said, I think that we are likely to see some shifts in U.S. policy, particularly around things like remittances, which has been really damaging to the Cuban economy. But a lot of that, I think, is going to be contingent on how the Diaz-Canel administration and the Communist Party in Cuba responds to the current crisis. If they respond with violence, and we saw some of that last night, it's going to be very difficult to change the political calculus in the United States so that the president feels that he has the space to the political space to make changes in U.S. Cuba policy.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis with us. Professor John Gutierrez, thank you very much indeed.